My husband's mistress was crying over my casket when I walked into the room. Alive. The lilies hit me first. That thick, suffocating sweetness that only exists in funeral homes. Organ music hummed low through the speakers, the kind of melody designed to make people weep whether they meant to or not. The casket was closed. Mahogany, polished, expensive. It had been checked 3 times that morning to make sure nobody would open it during the service. From a side viewing room, hidden behind shadow and grief, I watched my own funeral unfold. 47 guests, white roses on every surface, a framed photograph of me smiling next to the casket, a version of myself I barely recognized. And there she was, Solène, standing 3 feet from my husband, mascara running just enough to look devastated, but not enough to look messy. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. A colleague, the guests probably assumed, a family friend. Nobody in that room knew she had been sleeping with my husband for 18 months. Nobody except me. Callum stood at the front of the room, my husband of 11 years. He shook hands with mourners, accepted their condolences, pressed his palm against his chest like his heart was breaking. I knew that gesture. He used it during arguments when he wanted me to believe he was wounded by my accusations. He used it when he told me I was imagining things. He used it when he swore Solène was nothing more than a work contact. He was performing grief the same way he had performed our marriage. I should have felt powerful watching this. I had staged my own death. I had fooled everyone. I was standing 10 feet away from the man who had hollowed me out for over a decade, and he had no idea I was breathing. But my hands were shaking. Because the truth nobody tells you about faking your own death is this: you do not get to watch your funeral and feel like a victor. You watch it and realize just how small your life had become, how easily you could be erased, how few people in that room truly knew you at all. My sister Delphine stood near the back. She was the only person who knew. She clutched her purse too tightly, her eyes scanning the room, terrified someone would glance in my direction and recognize me. She had begged me not to come today. She had told me this was too dangerous, but I needed to see it. Have you ever looked at someone you loved and realized they would be better off if you simply vanished? Have you ever wondered how far you would go to make a man who erased you finally see you again? For 11 years, my marriage looked perfect from the outside. Magazine dinners, elegant vacations, a husband who opened doors and remembered anniversaries. But behind closed doors, I was disappearing. One correction at a time. One dismissal after another. One, I never said that. You are imagining things after the next. By the time Solène entered his life, I was already a ghost. She did not steal my husband. She simply moved into the space where I used to exist. And I let her, until I decided I was done letting anyone define whether I was alive or dead. If you are still here, you already understand something most people never admit out loud. Sometimes, the people who are supposed to love us are the ones who make us feel the most invisible. This channel tells stories about exactly that: betrayal, survival, the quiet wars that happen inside marriages, families, and friendships when nobody else is watching. If these kinds of stories grip you, take a second and hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications, because this one has a twist coming that I promise you will not see until it lands. Every story here is about more than drama. It is about the moment someone decides they deserve more than what they have been given. It is about the people who stop waiting for permission to reclaim their lives. And this story, the one you are watching right now, is one of those. So if you are ready, stay with me, because what happened at this funeral was only the beginning. The real question is how I ended up standing in the back of a room full of people mourning a woman who was not actually dead. That answer does not start here. It does not start with the casket or the lilies or the sight of my husband pretending to grieve. It starts 6 months earlier, a Thursday morning in November. Cold rain against the windows. A cup of coffee I never finished. It starts with a single photograph that arrived in my inbox with no subject line and no sender name. Just an image. Callum and Solène in the lobby of a hotel I had never heard of. His hand on the small of her back, her head tilted toward his shoulder. The woman in that photo was not someone I recognized. And I do not mean Solène. I mean me, the version of me who saw that image and realized she had been blind for longer than she wanted to admit. The version of me who sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours without moving, deciding what kind of woman she was going to become. That morning, I made a choice, and every single thing that happened after, including this funeral, including the empty casket, including the revenge no one saw coming, all of it traces back to that moment. The morning I decided to disappear started like every other morning in that house. I woke up at 6, showered, applied makeup I did not need for anyone who would actually see me, walked downstairs to a kitchen that cost more than my first apartment and started cooking. Brioche French toast, fresh strawberries sliced thin, a dusting of powdered sugar arranged just so. I had become the kind of woman who plated breakfast like it was going to be photographed. Callum came down at 7:15. He sat at the island, pulled out his phone, and scrolled through emails before his fork touched the plate. "This is good," he said. He did not look up. I stood on the other side of the counter, waiting. For what? I was not sure anymore. A glance. A question about my day. Something that proved I was more than furniture in his peripheral vision. "I have a doctor's appointment this afternoon," I said. It was a test. There was no appointment. I just wanted to see if the word doctor would make him pause. If he would ask what was wrong. If concern still lived somewhere in his body when it came to me. He scrolled for another half second. "Make sure the hedges get trimmed before the Davenports come for dinner Saturday." That was his answer. I nodded, smiled, cleared his plate when he left for work. And something inside me finished dying. I did not know yet that I would fake my own death. I did not have a plan or a timeline, but standing in that kitchen, scrubbing syrup off a plate he barely touched, I made a decision. I was done being invisible in my own life. I was not always this woman. There was a version of me who believed in things, who woke up excited, who walked through the world like it owed her nothing but offered everything anyway. At 24, I worked at a small gallery in Brooklyn. My jeans were always stained with paint from helping artists hang their pieces. My apartment had more books than furniture. I ate cheap Thai food 3 nights a week and thought I was rich because I got to spend my days surrounded by beauty. I believed art could save people. I believed love was something you built, not something you fell into and hoped would catch you. Callum Thorne walked into that gallery on a Tuesday afternoon in October. He wore a coat that cost more than my rent and stopped in front of a watercolor called The Leaving. A woman standing at a doorway, half in shadow, half in light. I told him the artist painted it after her divorce, that it was about the moment of walking away. He studied it for a long time. "I don't think she's leaving," he said. "I think she's deciding whether to stay." I remember how that sentence hit me, how it felt like he saw something nobody else did. He asked my name, asked about other pieces in the gallery, asked if I wanted to get coffee and talk about why I chose this work. 3 hours later, we were still talking. He listened like I was the only person in the world. He asked questions and remembered my answers. He laughed at my jokes and made me feel like my opinions mattered. 14 months later, I married him. I thought I had found the man who would see me forever. The first 2 years were everything I had been promised. Callum showed up at the gallery with coffee and bagels on Saturday mornings. He sat in the corner and read while I worked, content just to be in the same room. He learned the names of every artist I represented. He bought pieces I loved and hung them in our apartment without asking for my input because he already knew my taste. When we went on our honeymoon, he booked a yacht instead of flights. He knew I was afraid of flying and never once made me feel small for it. We spent 2 weeks on the water, eating meals he cooked himself, watching sunsets, talking about the life we would build. I thought, this is what forever feels like. When my mother died suddenly the following spring, Callum held me for 3 days straight. He cancelled meetings. He screened my calls. He made sure I ate, slept, and breathed. "I'll be your family now," he told me one night while I cried into his chest. "You'll never be alone again." I believed him. I believed him so completely that I let go of every safety net I had ever built. I stopped calling old friends as often. I let the gallery owners handle more decisions without me. I leaned into him like he was a foundation instead of a man. And for a while, he was. For a while, Callum Thorne was every good thing I had ever hoped for. But looking back now, I realized that the version of him I married was never meant to last. He was a performance, a first act designed to make me trust the rest of the play. The changes happened slowly. First, we moved out of the city. Callum said Westchester would be better for raising a family, for building a real life together. The house he bought had 6 bedrooms, a pool, and a kitchen I could have fit my entire Brooklyn apartment inside. I told myself this was growth. This was success. He asked me to step back from the gallery. Just for a while, he said. Just until we got settled. He was building his firm, traveling more, and he needed someone to manage the home, the events, the image. I said yes. Then I said yes again, and again, and again until I could not remember the last time I had said anything else. The Christmas cards started. Matching outfits, professional photographs, our faces smiling beside a fireplace we never actually used. I sent those cards to people I had not spoken to in years, and they sent back notes about how perfect our life looked. The charity galas came next. I learned which designers Callum preferred, which wines impressed his clients, which small-talk topics made me an asset to his career instead of a distraction. Instagram became my diary. Curated images of dinners, vacations, anniversary gifts. Every post told the world we were happy. But somewhere in between the photo shoots and the luncheons and the endless performance of being Mrs. Thorne, I stopped being Maren. I did not notice at first. You never do. The erosion happens so slowly that by the time you realize you are disappearing, there is almost nothing left to save. I became a wife, a hostess, a decoration, and I convinced myself that was enough. Callum gave me everything a woman was supposed to want: a beautiful home, financial security, a life that looked like a magazine spread. He gave me vacations and jewelry and closets full of clothes I did not need but wore anyway because they made me look like the wife he wanted. And I was grateful. That is the part that haunts me now. I was genuinely grateful for years. I mistook comfort for love. I mistook consistency for commitment. I mistook the fact that he never raised his voice for proof that he respected me. But silence can be its own kind of violence, and absence can hurt worse than any words. The woman I became in that marriage was someone my 24-year-old self would not have recognized. She would have looked at me standing in that 6-bedroom house, arranging flowers for a dinner party, practicing small talk in the mirror, and she would have asked one simple question: "What happened to you?" I did not have an answer, not then. But I am telling you this story now because what came next finally gave me one. The beautiful life Callum built for me was never free. I just did not see the invoice until it was too late. Every perfect dinner, every thoughtful gift, every moment I thought proved he loved me. All of it came with a price tag I would not see until years later. And by the time the bill arrived, I could not afford to pay it. Not without losing everything I had left. I found the receipt on a Wednesday. Callum had left his jacket on the back of a dining chair, which was unusual. He was meticulous about hanging things in their proper place. I picked it up to move it to the closet, and a small slip of paper fell from the pocket. A jewelry store, not the one where he usually shopped. This was a boutique I had never heard of, in a part of the city I had no reason to visit. One tennis bracelet, $18,000, purchased 6 weeks earlier. My heart did something strange. It did not race. It did not stop. It simply went quiet, like a child waiting to see if the adults in the room were about to start fighting. I told myself there was an explanation. His mother's birthday was coming up. Maybe he wanted to surprise her. Or perhaps it was for a client's wife, a thank you gift for some business favor I did not know about. I put the receipt back in his pocket, hung the jacket in the closet, went back to planning dinner like nothing had happened. But I watched. I waited through his mother's birthday. No bracelet. I waited through our anniversary. No bracelet. I waited through Christmas, New Year's, and Valentine's Day. No bracelet. The receipt stayed in my mind like a low hum I could not silence. I began checking pockets regularly. I began noticing credit card statements. I began building a mental catalogue of small things that did not add up. Denial is a strange creature. It wears the mask of trust. It tells you that questioning your husband makes you paranoid, insecure, ungrateful. It says that good wives do not snoop. Good wives believe. So I stayed quiet. I made small surrenders and called them faith. The distance grew so gradually that I almost missed it. Callum started working later. Trips that used to last 2 days stretched into 4. He began sleeping in the guest room when he came home past midnight, claiming he did not want to wake me. I told myself he was building something, providing for our future. But the small things kept accumulating. His laptop would snap shut the moment I entered his office. His phone stayed face down on every surface. He started taking calls in the car, in the yard, anywhere I could not overhear. And he stopped touching me. Not in dramatic ways. He still kissed me goodbye in the mornings. Still held my hand at public events. But the casual intimacy disappeared. The way he used to brush my shoulder when passing. The way he used to pull me close during movies. The way his hand used to rest on my knee during long drives. Gone. I tried everything. I bought lingerie that made me feel ridiculous. I suggested weekend getaways. I asked if we could try therapy, just to reconnect, just to talk. He declined gently every time. "We're fine," he said. "You're overthinking." That phrase became the refrain of my marriage. "We're fine." He said it so often and so calmly that I started to believe him. If something was wrong, he would tell me. If he was unhappy, he would say so. Callum was a direct man, an honest man. At least that was the story I needed to believe. "We're fine" became the lie I repeated to myself in the mirror every morning. The lie I whispered in the dark when I woke up alone at 3 in the morning and wondered where my husband actually was. We were fine. Until we were not. The furnace broke on a Thursday in February. Callum was in Chicago for a conference. The temperature inside the house dropped to 50 degrees by midnight. I called the repair service, but they could not come until morning. I moved into the guest room because it had a space heater and thicker curtains. I buried myself under 3 blankets and tried to sleep. At 2 in the morning, his office phone rang. Callum had a dedicated landline in his home office. He used it for international clients, he said. Something about clearer connections for overseas calls. I had never answered it before. It was his space, his work, his world. But that night, half asleep and frozen, I heard it ringing from down the hall. I thought maybe it was him, calling to check on me, worried about the heating. I picked up. "Callum?" A woman's voice. Soft. Familiar with his name in a way that made my stomach turn. "Baby, why are you calling from this number? I thought you weren't landing until—" She stopped. I did not breathe. "Hello?" she said. I hung up. My hands were shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the phone. I stood in his office, in the dark, staring at the receiver like it had bitten me. "Baby." She called him baby. The woman on the other end of that line knew his travel schedule. She knew when he was landing. She expected to hear from him at 2 in the morning. This was not a colleague. This was not a client. This was someone who had been waiting for my husband to come home to her. I stood in that office for 20 minutes, unable to move. By 3 in the morning, I had a plan. I would pack a bag, call Delphine, drive to her apartment in the city, figure out the rest later. I would leave a note, or maybe I would leave nothing at all. Let him come home to an empty house and wonder. I walked to the bedroom, opened the closet, stared at rows of clothes I had bought to be the wife he wanted, and I froze. Where would I go? I had not worked in 7 years. The gallery had new owners now. My savings had merged into our joint accounts long ago. My friends had become our friends, and most of them were really his clients or their wives. Delphine would take me in. But for how long? And what would I do when morning came? When lawyers got involved? when Callum's firm decided to protect their founding partner. I sat on the edge of the bed until sunrise. When the repair technician arrived at 8, I let him in, made coffee, discussed the furnace problem like a woman who had slept perfectly. By noon, I had rescheduled the wine cellar inventory and confirmed catering for the Davenport dinner. I did not leave. I told myself it was strategic. I needed proof. I needed a plan. I needed to be smart about this instead of emotional. But the truth was simpler and uglier. I was afraid. I chose the prison I knew over the wilderness I did not. I chose comfort over freedom. I chose to stay with a man who was sleeping with another woman because the alternative felt more terrifying than the betrayal itself. That was the night I stopped being a wife who suspected and became a wife who knew. If the story ended there, you would probably hate me. I would hate me too. A woman who finds out her husband is cheating and does nothing. Who reorganizes wine bottles instead of packing bags. Who convinces herself that staying is strength when it is really just fear wearing better clothes. But here is what I did not know that night. I was not the only one watching. I was not the only one gathering evidence. And the woman on the other end of that phone call was not the only secret living inside my marriage. What came next proved I was never crazy. I was just outnumbered. Because while I was lying awake wondering if I had imagined everything, there was already a plan in motion. People were already talking. Decisions had already been made about my future, my finances, and my place in Callum's life. The affair was not the secret. The affair was just the part they let me see. There was something else underneath it. Something that had been building for longer than I wanted to admit. Something that would eventually give me no choice but to disappear. And when I finally discovered what it was, staying stopped being an option. Not because I had finally found my courage, but because they were about to take everything from me anyway. If you are still watching, stay with me. Because the woman I was that night, the one who chose to stay, she had no idea what she was about to uncover, and neither do you. 3 weeks after the phone call, my sister showed up unannounced. I was in the middle of reviewing seating charts for a charity luncheon when the doorbell rang. Delphine stood on the porch in a wrinkled coat, her hair pulled back in a way that told me she had not slept well. We had not spoken in almost 8 months. "I need to talk to you," she said. "Not here." I started to invite her inside, but she shook her head before I could finish the sentence. "Somewhere else. Somewhere he doesn't own." The way she said, he made my stomach tighten. We drove to a diner 20 minutes outside of town. The kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner since morning. Delphine chose a table in the back corner, facing the door. She did not order food. Neither did I. For a long moment, we just sat there. Two sisters who used to tell each other everything, now separated by years of silence and a marriage that had quietly pushed us apart. "You look thin," she said finally. "I've been busy. You look like you're disappearing." I did not answer. I wrapped my hands around the coffee cup and waited. Delphine reached into her bag and pulled out a folded envelope. She placed it on the table between us, but did not push it toward me. Her fingers stayed pressed against the paper, like she was afraid of what would happen once she let go. "I didn't want to be the one to tell you this," she said. "But no one else is going to." Delphine had a friend named Caroline who used to work at Callum's firm. Caroline left 6 months ago, quietly. No farewell party, no 2 weeks' notice. She packed her desk one Friday afternoon and never came back. "She called me last week," Delphine said. "She'd been wanting to reach out for a while, but didn't know how. She wasn't sure if you knew." "Knew what?" Delphine slid the envelope across the table. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were photographs, printouts of emails, a lease agreement for an apartment in Manhattan, credit card statements with charges I did not recognize, and a name. "Solène Marchand. Everyone at the office knows," Delphine said softly. "They've known for 3 years. 3 years." I stared at the photographs. Callum and a woman I had never seen before. Dark hair. Red lipstick. The kind of effortless beauty that made you feel inadequate just looking at her. They were at a restaurant, his hand on her knee, her head tilted toward him in a way that spoke of intimacy, comfort, time. He pays her rent, Delphine continued. That apartment in the documents, it's in his name, but she lives there. Has for 2 years. I could not breathe. There's more. Delphine's voice cracked. Caroline saw billing statements on his desk. From an OBGYN. Recent ones. She doesn't know for sure, but she did not finish the sentence. She did not have to. Every moment from the past 3 years came rushing back. Every late night. Every business trip. Every time he said we're fine while looking through me instead of at me. I had not been paranoid. I had been blind. I wanted to be angry at Delphine for not telling me sooner. But when I looked at her face, I saw something I had not expected. Guilt. I tried, she said quietly, after Mom died. I tried to call you. I tried to visit. But every time I reached out, something got in the way. Callum would answer your phone and say you were resting. Or he'd email me saying you weren't ready for visitors. Or the one time I drove out here, you weren't home, and he told me you'd gone to a spa for the week. I remembered that week. I had been home the entire time, rearranging the library because Callum said the shelves looked cluttered. I thought you didn't want to see me, Delphine continued. I thought you blamed me for something, for not being there when Mom was sick, for not handling the funeral the way you wanted. I spent 2 years thinking my sister hated me. I never hated you. I know that now. Her eyes were wet, but he made sure I didn't know it then. The weight of what she was saying pressed down on me. Callum had not just been having an affair. He had been isolating me, cutting me off from the one person who might have noticed what was happening. The one person who might have told me the truth years ago. I reached across the table and took my sister's hand. No more secrets, I said, between us. No matter what happens next. Delphine squeezed my fingers so hard it almost hurt. No more secrets, she repeated. For the first time in years, I did not feel completely alone. On the drive home, I replayed everything Delphine had told me. 3 years. An apartment. Possibly a pregnancy. This was not a fling. This was not a mistake he would eventually regret. This was a parallel life. A complete replacement waiting in the wings. Celine was not the other woman. I was. I had been the other woman in my own marriage for 3 years without knowing it. The one he came home to out of obligation. The one who managed his house and hosted his dinners while he built something real with someone else. The charity luncheons, the Christmas cards, the perfect Instagram posts, all of it was a facade, a performance designed to protect his reputation while he quietly constructed a future that did not include me. And the pregnancy. If Solène was carrying his child, then I was not just being replaced. I was being erased, written out of his story like a rough draft he no longer needed. When I walked back into that 6-bedroom house, I saw it differently. The artwork he had bought to impress me. The kitchen I cooked in every morning. The bedroom where he had not touched me in months. None of it was mine. It never had been. I was a placeholder. A temporary chapter in the story of Callum Thorne, and he had already started writing my ending. The only question was whether I would let him finish it, or whether I would write my own. That night, I made dinner. Salmon with dill sauce, roasted vegetables, a glass of wine I poured but did not drink. Callum came home at 9. He kissed my cheek without looking at me. Ate half the plate. Complimented the seasoning with the same flat tone he used for everything. "This is good," he said. The same words, the same emptiness. I watched him scroll through his phone while he chewed. I watched him check his watch twice. I watched him excuse himself to take a call in his office, closing the door behind him. And I thought about Solène. Was he texting her right now? Was he telling her he would be there soon? Was she waiting for him in that apartment he paid for, carrying his child, building the life that should have been mine? 3 years. An apartment, maybe a baby. And that morning, I had still made him breakfast. That was the moment I realized the truth. If I did not leave this marriage, it was going to erase me completely. Not through violence or cruelty, or any of the obvious ways a person destroys another. Through indifference. Through slow, quiet replacement. Through convincing me that I was crazy until I forgot I had ever been sane. I could not let that happen. I would not let that happen. So I started making a different kind of plan. I did not confront him. That was the first decision I made, the most important one. Every instinct told me to scream, to throw the photographs in his face, to demand answers I already knew he would lie about. But I had seen enough divorces among his business associates to understand how this would play out. Callum had the best lawyers in the state. His firm handled cases for judges, politicians, people with power I could not begin to match. If I accused him of infidelity, he would deny it. He would claim I was unstable, paranoid, bitter. He would turn his colleagues into witnesses who would swear he was a devoted husband, and I would lose everything. So, instead of confronting him, I watched. I became a spy in my own home. Invisible, silent, observant. 2 weeks after Delphine's visit, I found the burner phone. It was tucked inside his gym bag, wrapped in a pair of socks. A cheap prepaid device with no apps except messaging. I did not touch it. I did not read the messages. I simply noted where it was, how he hid it, and put everything back exactly as I found it. I started keeping mental notes. When he said he had a client dinner, I checked later, and there was no charge on any of our credit cards. When he claimed to be working late, I called the office, and his assistant said he had left at 6. When he took calls in his office with the door closed, I pressed my ear against the wood and listened to laughter, soft words, a tone he had not used with me in years. I was building a case, not for divorce, for something else entirely. The idea came from an artist I had once admired. Theodora Vance was a conceptual artist who became famous in the 90s for a piece called The Empty Frame. She had staged her own death within the art world, announced her retirement, held a memorial exhibition for her career, then vanished for 5 years before reappearing with a new identity and a new body of work. The art world had been furious, but Theodora had walked away free. I remembered reading about her in graduate school and thinking it was brilliant, a woman who refused to let others define the end of her story, who took control of her own narrative in the most dramatic way possible. I dug up old articles about her, interviews where she explained her reasoning. Death is the ultimate freedom, she had said. When they think you're gone, they stop watching. They stop trying to control you. You become invisible, and invisibility is the only true power. I read that quote 6 times. Then I read it again. Theodora had faked her death in the art world. What if I faked my death in the real one? The thought was absurd at first. The kind of thing you think at 3 in the morning and dismiss by sunrise. But the more I considered it, the more it made a terrible kind of sense. Callum had already erased me emotionally, professionally, socially. He had turned me into a ghost long before I considered becoming one officially. This was not art. This was survival. And survival required the kind of plan that no one would see coming. I reached out to Genevieve Thatcher on a Tuesday. We had worked together at the gallery 15 years ago, back when she was finishing medical school and I was still wearing paint-stained jeans. She had moved to Vermont after residency, running a small practice in a town where nobody knew anyone connected to Callum's world. We met at a coffee shop near Burlington. She looked older than I remembered, but her eyes still held the same warmth. "You look terrible," she said when she saw me. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in months. I told her everything. The affair, the isolation, the pregnancy rumors, the burner phone and the apartment and the 3 years of lies. Then I told her my plan. She did not react at first, just sat there, stirring her coffee, processing. "You want me to falsify medical records," she said finally. "A terminal diagnosis, something that explains a rapid decline, something that makes my death believable and unquestioned. Maren, if I get caught, I lose my license. I lose everything I've built. I know. And I wouldn't ask if I had any other choice." Genevieve stared out the window. The silence stretched between us. "His lawyers," she said slowly. "They would destroy you in a divorce. Is that what you're telling me? They would take everything, and they would make sure I left with nothing but a reputation for being unstable and ungrateful. He's been laying the groundwork for years. The isolation, the way he talks about me to colleagues. I've heard him call me fragile when he thinks I'm not listening." She closed her eyes. "Autoimmune," she said quietly. Something aggressive but rare. Affects the nervous system, causes rapid deterioration. Hard to predict, hard to disprove. Is that a yes? Genevieve opened her eyes and looked at me with something between pity and resolve. It's a maybe. But you need to understand what you're asking. Once we start this, there's no going back. I know. Do you? I held her gaze without flinching. I'm already dead, Genevieve. I'm just making it official. She agreed to help, reluctantly, painfully. But she agreed. Finding a lawyer who was not connected to Callum's network took 2 weeks. Her name was Vera Sinclair. She worked out of a small firm in Albany, specializing in estate planning for clients who valued discretion above all else. Delphine found her through a contact of a contact, someone who owed my sister a favor and knew how to keep quiet. Vera had grey hair cut short and eyes that missed nothing. She listened to my story without interrupting, making notes in a leather-bound journal that looked older than I was. When I finished, she set down her pen. You want to draft a new will, she said. One that excludes your husband from inheriting anything of consequence. Yes, and you want specific provisions for your funeral arrangements. Closed casket, private ceremony, immediate cremation, no autopsy, I added. That's critical. Vera studied me for a long moment. Mrs. Thorne, Marin, I've helped many people plan for difficult circumstances, contentious divorces, estranged families, situations where the usual rules don't apply. But what you're describing goes beyond estate planning. You're not preparing for death. You're staging one. I did not deny it. I can draft these documents, she continued. They will be legally sound. But I want you to understand the weight of what you're choosing. Once you walk through this door, the woman you were ceases to exist. Legally, socially, completely. That woman already ceased to exist, years ago. I'm just putting it on paper. Vera held my gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. Very well. I'll need the names of your beneficiaries and your specific wishes for asset distribution. Everything goes to my sister Delphine, except for 3 pieces in my personal art collection. Those get donated to the Brooklyn Gallery where I started my career. Vera wrote it down without comment. When I signed the documents an hour later, my hand did not shake. I was done trembling. The hardest part was deciding how to die. A car accident was the obvious choice. Drive off a cliff somewhere remote. Let them find the wreckage but not the body. Washed away by a river, swept into dense forest, never recovered. But car accidents are investigated. Police reports, insurance claims, questions that demanded answers. A boating accident had similar problems. The Coast Guard would search. Dive teams would scour the water. Someone would keep looking until something was found. I needed a death that was tragic but explainable. Something that would generate sympathy instead of suspicion. Something that would end the questions before they began. It was Delphine who suggested the cabin, our mother's place in the Adirondacks. A small wooden structure on 30 acres of forest, miles from the nearest neighbor. No cell service, no security cameras, nothing but trees and silence. A fire, she said quietly. We were sitting in her apartment, papers spread across her kitchen table, planning a death like other sisters planned weddings. The cabin is old. The wiring is ancient. Everyone knows those places go up fast, especially in winter when the heating systems are pushed to their limits. And the body? By the time anyone finds it, there won't be anything left to identify. Just ashes and burned timber and a widow's tragic story about her sick wife going to the mountains for peace. I closed my eyes. That cabin held every memory I had of my mother. Her books were still on the shelves. Her coffee cups still hung in the kitchen. Her quilt still lay across the bed where she had slept every summer of my childhood. Burning it meant losing the last physical connection I had to her, but keeping it meant staying trapped in a marriage that was killing me slower than any fire ever could. Are you sure about this? Delphine asked. I thought about my mother, about the woman she had raised me to be, about the strength she had carried through her own difficult marriage, her own quiet battles. She would have wanted me to survive. Yes, I said, I'm sure. Delphine reached across the table, and took my hand. "Then we have a plan." Over the following weeks, the pieces fell into place. Genevieve provided the medical records. Vera finalized the will. Delphine handled the details I could not manage from inside the fishbowl of Callum's surveillance. I continued playing my role, the devoted wife, the gracious hostess, the woman who smiled at charity galas and posted perfect photographs and never once let her mask slip. But underneath, I was dismantling my life piece by piece. I started moving money, small amounts, untraceable transfers to accounts Callum did not know existed. I gathered documents, photographs, evidence of the affair that Delphine had given me, hidden in a safety deposit box that only she could access. I was not just planning an exit, I was planning a resurrection. The woman who walked into that marriage 11 years ago was gone. Callum had made sure of that. He had replaced her with someone manageable, someone quiet, someone who made breakfast and asked no questions. But the woman who was going to walk out of the ashes, she was someone else entirely. I was planning a funeral for the person I had allowed myself to become. The wife, the hostage, the ghost who haunted her own home. And when that woman died, truly died, what would rise in her place would be something Callum Thorne had never anticipated. Someone who was done disappearing. Someone who was ready to make him answer for every lie, every betrayal, every moment he had made me feel invisible. The plan was set. The clock was ticking. All that remained was the dying. If you have stayed with me this far, you are invested. You want to know if she actually goes through with it. You want to see what happens when Callum realizes his wife is not as dead as he thought. Stories like this only exist because people like you watch until the end. So if you have not already, take a second to subscribe and hit that notification bell. The next part of this story will test everything you think you know about revenge, justice, and what a woman is capable of when she has nothing left to lose. Stay with me. The funeral is just the beginning. The night before I was supposed to die, I walked through the house one last time. It was after midnight. Callum was asleep in the guest room. He had been sleeping there every night for the past 2 months, claiming my tossing and turning disturbed his rest. I moved through each room like a visitor in a museum. The living room with its designer furniture that no one ever sat on. The dining room where we hosted parties for people who did not know my middle name. The kitchen where I had cooked 1,000 meals that tasted like ash. Everything was beautiful. Everything was perfectly arranged. And none of it had ever been mine. I stopped in front of the one piece of art I had chosen myself. The leaving. The watercolor we had stood in front of the day we met, the woman in the doorway, half in shadow, half in light. Callum had bought it for me as a wedding gift. He said it reminded him of the moment he fell in love with me, the moment he realized I saw the world differently than everyone else. I took it off the wall. It was the only thing in that house I was taking with me. The frame was lighter than I expected. I wrapped it in a blanket and carried it to my car, setting it carefully in the trunk next to the small bag I had already packed. When I walked back inside, I looked at the walls where the painting had hung. A clean rectangle of darker paint, a space that proved something had been there and was now gone. Just like me. I did not feel sentimental. I did not cry. I felt like I was finally waking up from a decade-long sleep. I was almost asleep when I heard footsteps in the hallway. My bedroom door was slightly open. I had left it that way deliberately, part of maintaining the appearance that nothing had changed. I closed my eyes and controlled my breathing. Slow, even, the rhythm of someone deep in sleep. The footsteps stopped outside my door. Callum stood there for a long moment. I could feel him watching me through the darkness. Then he moved past, toward his office at the end of the hall. I heard the door close. A lock. Click. Then his voice, low and careful. "It's me," he said. "No, she's asleep." A pause. "We just have to wait a little longer. The timing has to be right." My entire body went cold. "I know you're frustrated," he continued. "I am too. But if we move too fast, it looks suspicious. We need to be patient." Another pause. "Longer this time. I love you too. Just a few more months. Once everything is in place, we won't have to hide anymore." The call ended. I heard him moving around his office, papers shuffling, a drawer opening and closing, then silence. I lay in that bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying his words. We just have to wait a little longer. He was not planning to divorce me. He was planning to outlast me. To wait until my fake illness became real in his narrative. Until I was so isolated and so broken that leaving would look like proof of my instability. Or maybe he was hoping I would simply disappear on my own. Walk into traffic, take too many pills, make his problem solve itself. I had thought I was one step ahead. But he had been playing a longer game than I realized. That was the moment I understood. Leaving was not enough. Disappearing was not enough. I needed him to see what he had done. I left at 5 in the morning. Callum was still asleep in the guest room. I did not leave a note. I did not say goodbye. I simply walked out the front door with my small bag, locked it behind me, and drove away from the house that had been my prison for 11 years. The roads were empty. Fog hung low over the highway, turning the world grey and soft. I drove north for 3 hours, following routes I had memorized as a child when my mother would take Delphine and me to the cabin every summer. The Adirondacks in early spring are cold and unforgiving. Snow still clung to the shadows. The trees were bare, their branches skeletal against the pale sky. I turned onto the dirt road that led to the cabin just after 8. The forest closed in around me, thick and silent. No neighbors, no cell service, nothing but 30 acres of wilderness and a structure my mother had loved more than any place on earth. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered. The wood had weathered to a dull grey. The porch sagged slightly on one side. The windows were clouded with years of dust and neglect. But when I unlocked the door and stepped inside, it smelled exactly the way it always had. Pine and old books, and the faint sweetness of the lavender my mother used to hang in bundles from the ceiling beams. Her coffee cups still sat on the shelf above the sink. Her quilt still lay folded at the foot of the bed. Her favorite chair still faced the window that looked out over the lake. I set my bag down on the floor and stood in the center of the room. This was where I was supposed to die. This was where Marin Thorne would burn away, leaving nothing but ashes and a story people would tell at dinner parties for years to come. The devoted wife. The fragile woman. The tragedy no one saw coming. I walked to the window and looked out at the lake. The water was still, dark, perfectly calm, and I started preparing. I worked methodically. First, I gathered everything that connected me to my old life. Credit cards, driver's license, the monogrammed luggage tags Callum had given me for Christmas 3 years ago, photographs of us together, smiling at events I could barely remember. I built a fire in the stone fireplace and fed everything into the flames. The plastic of the credit cards melted and twisted. The photographs curled at the edges, faces disappearing into ash. I watched Mrs. Callum Thorne burn away piece by piece. Next, I went through the cabin itself. I moved the furniture away from the walls. I opened the accelerant canister Delphine had obtained and carefully soaked the structural beams along the far wall. Not enough to make it obvious, just enough to ensure that once the fire started, it would not stop. I worked slowly, precisely. This was not about destruction. This was about transformation. When I finished, I stood in the doorway and looked back at the room. The afternoon light came through the windows at an angle, cutting the space into sections of shadow and brightness. For a moment, I thought about the leaving, the woman standing at the threshold, deciding. Was she walking away from something, or toward it? Callum had said she was deciding whether to stay, but he was wrong. She was deciding who she was going to become once she stepped through that door. I pulled out my phone to send Delphine the final signal, the message that would tell her to start making calls, to notify authorities, to begin the performance of grief that would make my death believable. But before I could type the words, my phone buzzed. A message from Delphine, all capital letters. Don't do anything yet. Just found out something. It's about Celine. My finger hovered over the screen. Then the phone rang. Delphine was breathless when I answered. "Where are you?" she asked. "Are you at the cabin?" Yes. What's wrong? Don't light the fire. Not yet. Just listen. I sat down on the porch steps, the phone pressed to my ear, the smell of accelerant still clinging to my clothes. I've been digging, Delphine said, into Soline's background, trying to find anything we could use. And I found something. What? Her father. His name is Maurice Marchand. The name meant nothing to me. He's a corporate lawyer, Delphine continued, specializes in high-asset divorces and family law, and he's been on retainer with Callum's firm for 6 years. The world tilted. Soline is not just his mistress, Delphine said. She was placed there. Her father and Callum's partners orchestrated it. She was hired specifically to get close to him, to monitor you, to document anything that could be used as evidence of instability or unfitness. I could not breathe. The affair is real, Delphine went on. I'm not saying it's fake, but it started as a strategy, a way to build a case against you before you even knew you needed to defend yourself. Every late night, every dismissal, every time he made you feel crazy, it was deliberate. They've been collecting ammunition for years. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. Marin, if you had tried to divorce him, they would have buried you. They have documentation of every time you called his office asking where he was, every friend you stopped seeing, every event you missed. They've been building a narrative that you're unstable, isolated, paranoid. Why? The word came out broken. Because you have access to half of everything he owns, and his firm cannot afford the publicity of a messy divorce, so they created an insurance policy. A woman who could testify that you were unstable long before the marriage ended. A woman who could make you look like the problem. I pressed my hand against my mouth to keep from screaming. 3 years, the apartment, the pregnancy rumors, all of it was strategic. There's more, Delphine said quietly. Soline is flying in for the funeral. What? She's attending, as a family friend, a colleague paying her respects. The image hit me like a physical blow. Soline standing beside my casket, crying into a tissue, accepting condolences from people who had no idea she had been part of erasing me. Marin? Delphine's voice pulled me back. Are you still there? Yes. What do you want to do? I looked at the cabin behind me, at the accelerant-soaked beams, at the life I had been ready to burn away. And I made a different choice. I stood up and walked back into the cabin. The afternoon light was fading. Shadows stretched across the floor, reaching toward the fireplace where the remains of my old identity still smoldered. If Soline wants to attend my funeral, I said slowly, then I'll give her one. What do you mean? I mean, I'm not running anymore. I'm not disappearing into the woods and letting them write my ending. If they want to bury me this badly, I'll let them. I'll give them the funeral of their dreams. Marin. And then I'll walk in. Delphine was silent for a long moment. You realize what you're saying, she said finally. You're talking about faking your death and then revealing yourself publicly. That's fraud. That's illegal. You could go to prison. So could they. For what they've done to me. For the conspiracy. For the documentation. For turning my life into evidence against me. You don't have proof. Then we'll get it. You said you've been digging. Keep digging. Find everything. Every email. Every memo. Every piece of communication between Callum and Maurice Marchand. Find the paper trail that proves this was deliberate. And what are you going to do? I'm going to die. Officially. Let the paperwork go through. Let Genevieve's diagnosis stand. Let the world believe that Marin Thorne is gone. And then I'm going to watch them celebrate. I could hear Delphine breathing on the other end of the line. This is dangerous, she said. I know. If it goes wrong, you lose everything. I've already lost everything. The only question now is whether I take them down with me. Delphine exhaled slowly. Okay. Tell me what you need. Time. A place to stay where no one will recognize me. And access to the funeral. I can do that. And one more thing. What? I looked around the cabin one last time. At my mother's books. Her quilt. Her chair. Don't burn this place. Not yet. I might need it later. Understood. I hung up and stood in the silence. The plan had changed. The woman I had been when I drove up here this morning had been running away, trying to disappear, hoping that distance would be enough. But the woman standing here now understood something different. Disappearing was not enough. I needed them to see me. I spent the next hour undoing everything I had prepared. I cleaned the accelerant off the beams as best I could. I moved the furniture back into place. I made the cabin look untouched, unremarkable, exactly as it had been when I arrived. Then I packed my small bag, took one last look around, and locked the door behind me. The drive back toward civilization felt different than the drive up had. I was not running toward death anymore. I was not trying to erase myself. I was planning a resurrection. By the time I reached the motel Delphine had recommended, a small place 40 miles outside the city where no one asked questions and cash was still accepted, I had stopped shaking. I checked in under a false name, Evelyn Marsh, a woman with no history, no connections, no husband who had spent years turning her into a ghost. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my reflection in the mirror across the room. Maren Thorne was about to die. The death certificate would be filed, the will would be processed, the funeral would be planned, and everyone who had spent the last 3 years erasing me would gather to mourn the woman they had worked so hard to destroy. Callum would stand at the front of the room and perform grief. Selene would cry beside my casket, and I would be there, watching, waiting, because if they wanted to bury me that badly, I decided to let them. I would give them the funeral of their dreams, and then I would walk in, not as the fragile wife they had documented, not as the unstable woman they had spent years creating on paper, as someone who had seen everything, who had evidence, who had finally stopped being afraid. I did not burn down the cabin, but I was about to burn down everything else. The next morning, I called Delphine from a payphone outside a gas station. Evelyn Marsh did not have a cell phone. She did not have credit cards or social media or any of the digital footprints that made modern people traceable. She was a ghost by design. I need you to report me missing, I told Delphine. Today. Are you sure you want to do this? I've never been more sure of anything. There was a pause. Then, Delphine's voice, steady and certain. Okay, walk me through it. Call my house first. Ask for me. When Callum says I'm not there, act concerned. Mention that I had a doctor's appointment yesterday and you have not heard from me since. He'll say you're probably resting. Push back. Say it's not like me to go silent. Say you're worried because of the diagnosis. Make him start questioning when he last actually saw me. And then, wait 4 hours. Call the police. File a missing person report. Tell them about the medical condition. Tell them I've been disoriented lately. That you're afraid I might have wandered off somewhere and gotten lost. Delphine was writing this down. I could hear the scratch of pen on paper. The cabin, she said. Do I mention it? Not immediately. Let them search locally first. Then, maybe a day later, you remember that I used to go there when I needed space. Suggest they check it, and when they find it empty, they'll assume I was there and left, or that I never made it. Either way, combined with Genevieve's medical records, they'll conclude I'm either lost in the woods or had some kind of medical emergency. And the body? I took a breath. There is no body. That's the point. I'm missing, presumed dead due to the condition and the circumstances. The will specifies cremation, so no one expects to see remains. The funeral is a memorial, not a viewing. Delphine was quiet for a long moment. This could actually work, she said finally. It has to. Over the next week, everything unfolded exactly as we had planned. Delphine called Callum. He dismissed her concerns, just as I knew he would. She called back 3 hours later, her voice higher, more panicked. She called the police that evening. The missing person report went through without issue. I had a documented medical condition, a history of doctor's appointments, a sister who could testify that I had been declining mentally and physically. The police searched the house. They interviewed Callum, who performed concern beautifully. He told them about my diagnosis, about how I had been withdrawing lately, how he had been worried but did not want to pressure me. He played the devoted husband so convincingly that I almost believed him myself. 3 days later, Delphine remembered the cabin. The police drove up to check it. They found it empty but showed signs of recent occupancy. A fire in the fireplace. Tire tracks in the mud outside. They searched the surrounding woods. They called in volunteers. They combed the shoreline of the lake. They found nothing. After a week, the official conclusion was that I had likely succumbed to my medical condition somewhere in the wilderness, that my body might never be recovered due to the density of the forest and the wildlife in the area. It was tragic. It was unfortunate. It was perfectly believable. Callum signed the death certificate without hesitation. The will went into probate. Vera processed the paperwork with quiet efficiency, asking no questions, honoring the instructions I had left. The funeral was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Closed casket, private ceremony, immediate cremation as per the deceased's wishes. Everything was proceeding exactly as it should, and through it all, I remained invisible. A woman named Evelyn Marsh, living in a motel, watching the news reports about the missing wife of prominent attorney Callum Thorne. I cut my hair, dyed it darker, wore glasses I did not need, dressed in clothes that made me look 10 years older. I became someone nobody would look at twice, and I waited. Vera called Delphine 5 days after the death certificate was signed. Delphine put her on speaker so I could hear. "The will is being processed," Vera said. "Everything is in order. The estate will transfer to you as specified, minus the 3 pieces designated for the gallery. How long will it take?" Delphine asked. 4 to 6 weeks, assuming no one contests it. Would Callum contest it? There was a pause. Typically, a spouse would contest being excluded from a will, but in this case, your sister left him the house and several accounts that technically offset the value. She was very careful about the math. It would be difficult for him to argue he was unfairly treated. Delphine glanced at me. I nodded. "And the personal effects?" Delphine asked. "The items still in the house? You have the right to collect them at your convenience. I'd recommend doing so before the estate fully closes. Once the house transfers back to Mr. Thorne as joint property, your access becomes more complicated." "Understood. Miss Thorne," Vera said, her tone shifting slightly. "May I ask you something off the record?" Delphine hesitated. "Of course, your sister was very specific about the funeral arrangements. Very deliberate. In my experience, people who plan that carefully are usually protecting themselves from something." Neither of us spoke. "I hope," Vera continued slowly, "that whatever she was protecting herself from, it was worth the measures she took." "It was," Delphine said quietly. "Good. Then I'll continue processing the paperwork and will contact you when everything is finalized." The call ended. I sat back against the motel headboard, staring at the water-stained ceiling. Vera knew. She might not know the specifics, but she understood that something larger was happening. And she was choosing to proceed anyway. That made her either an ally or a liability. I hoped it was the former. While the legal paperwork moved forward, Delphine became a detective. She contacted former employees of Callum's firm, quietly, carefully. People who had left under strange circumstances. People who might have seen things they were not supposed to see. Caroline, the woman who had first told Delphine about Solène, introduced her to 3 others, 2 paralegals and an accountant, who had all resigned within the past 18 months. They met in coffee shops, parking lots, quiet corners of libraries. They spoke in low voices about things they had witnessed but been too afraid to report. One paralegal had seen emails between Callum and Maurice Marchand discussing the Marin situation and long-term asset protection strategies. The accountant had processed payments to Solène that were categorized as consulting fees but had no corresponding work product. Another paralegal had overheard a conversation between Callum and his senior partner about managing perception and building a paper trail. Delphine recorded everything, took notes, gathered names and dates and details. She forwarded copies to an encrypted email account I had set up under Evelyn Marsh's name. Meanwhile, I did my own research. I spent hours in public libraries using computers that could not be traced to me. I pulled property records, business filings, financial disclosures. I mapped the connections between Callum's firm, Maurice Marchand's practice, and Solene's sudden employment. The timeline was damning. Solene had been hired 3 months after Callum and I moved to Westchester, 3 months after I stopped working at the gallery, 3 months after I became financially dependent on him. She had been insurance, a contingency plan, in case the devoted wife ever decided to stop being devoted. The affair had likely developed naturally over time, but its foundation was strategic, calculated, designed to protect Callum's assets and reputation if the marriage ever needed to end. I printed everything, created folders, built a case that would make any lawyer pause. And I waited for the funeral. There were moments, late at night in that motel room, when I questioned everything. What I was doing was illegal, faking my own death, fraud, conspiracy. If I was caught, I would lose everything. My freedom, my credibility, any chance of a normal life ever again. And for what? To humiliate a man who had stopped loving me. To expose an affair everyone probably already suspected? To prove I had been right about my own suffering? Was any of that worth risking prison? But then, I would remember. I would remember the way Callum had looked at me the morning I mentioned the doctor's appointment. The flat disinterest, the immediate pivot to something that mattered more. I would remember the phone call at 2 in the morning, the woman's voice calling him baby. I would remember Delphine's revelation, that Solene had been placed, that the affair was part of a strategy, that they had been building a case against me for 3 years. This was not about a cheating husband. This was about a man who had systematically erased me, who had isolated me from my family, my career, my sense of self, who had turned my entire existence into evidence that could be used against me. And when I had finally started to suspect, when I had finally started to question, he had not ended the affair or sought counseling, or done any of the things a decent human being might do. He had whispered into the phone at 3 in the morning that they just needed to wait a little longer. Wait for what? For me to collapse completely? For my fake illness to become real through stress and isolation? For me to become so broken that leaving would be easy? I was not doing this for revenge. I was doing this for survival, because the alternative was letting them win, letting them write my story, letting them turn me into the fragile, unstable woman they needed me to be. And I refused. I absolutely refused. Pause for a second, because I need you to think about something. If you found out your partner's entire affair was part of a legal strategy to destroy you, what would you do? Would you disappear quietly, take whatever settlement they offered, and try to rebuild somewhere far away? Or would you come back and haunt them? Would you let them bury you? Or would you walk into that funeral and make them answer for every lie? Tell me in the comments, Team Vanish or Team Vengeance, because I want to know if I'm the only person who would choose what I chose. The funeral was 3 days away. Delphine had secured me an invitation, listed as a distant cousin from my mother's side, someone no one would recognize or question, someone who could sit in the back and watch. I had the evidence organized, the timeline mapped, the connections documented. I had a plan for what would happen after I revealed myself, how I would present the information, who I would contact, what I would say, but underneath all the preparation, there was something else. Fear. Because once I walked through those doors, there was no going back. Maren Thorne would stop being dead and become something else entirely. A woman who had faked her own death to expose her husband's conspiracy. A woman who had committed fraud to escape fraud. A woman who had chosen the wilderness over the prison and then decided to burn the prison down. I did not know what would happen next, but I knew I could not stop now. The funeral was in 3 days, and I was going to be there. I arrived 30 minutes before the service was scheduled to begin. My hair was darker now, cut shorter, styled differently than I had ever worn it during my marriage. I wore minimal makeup and glasses with clear frames that changed the shape of my face. A black dress I had bought at a department store, nothing designer, nothing Callum would recognize. I looked like someone's forgotten cousin, someone who belonged in the back row. Delphine met me at the side entrance. She wore grief convincingly, her eyes red from what could have been real tears or strategic preparation. She took my arm and guided me through the hallway toward the main room. The casket was already in place, mahogany, polished until it reflected the soft lighting, closed just as my will had specified, surrounded by white roses and lilies, the same flowers Callum had sent me on our 5th anniversary. A large photograph sat on an easel beside it. Me, smiling at some charity event 2 years ago. My hair perfect, my dress expensive, my expression carefully composed into something that looked like happiness. Underneath the photograph, a small placard read, "In loving memory of Maren Ashford Thorne." I stared at my own name, at the dates that marked the beginning and end of a life, at the summary of 36 years, reduced to a photograph and a closed box. My hands started shaking. "You can still leave," Delphine whispered. "We can walk out right now." I shook my head. Then, "Let's sit down before people start arriving." We took seats in the back corner, far enough to be unremarkable, close enough to see everything. I waited. They started arriving 15 minutes before the service. The Westchester social circle came first. Women in tasteful black, men in expensive suits. They signed the guest book with careful signatures and soft expressions of sympathy. I recognized most of them. Dinner party guests, charity gala attendees, people who had eaten at my table and complimented my hosting and never once asked how I was actually doing. They murmured to each other in low voices. Such a tragedy. She was so young. I heard it was some kind of autoimmune condition. Very aggressive. Callum must be devastated. I watched them take their seats, arranging themselves in the hierarchy of social importance. Front rows for the most connected, middle rows for the colleagues and acquaintances, back rows for people like me, the ones nobody needed to impress. Callum's family arrived together. His mother, Eleanor, moved like royalty. Perfectly coiffed silver hair, a black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She accepted condolences with practiced grace, her face arranged in an expression of dignified sorrow. His brother, Senator Richard Thorne, followed close behind. Tall, handsome, politically polished. He shook hands firmly, smiled sadly, and made brief eye contact with everyone, as if their attendance at his sister-in-law's funeral would be personally remembered come election season. They took seats in the front row directly across from the casket. Eleanor dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. I wanted to laugh. She had never liked me, had made it clear from the beginning that I was not quite good enough for her son, not connected enough, not wealthy enough, not polished enough. And now she was crying at my funeral. The performance was flawless. She arrived exactly 3 minutes before the service was scheduled to begin. Solène Marchand walked through the doors like she had been designed for this moment. Black dress, simple but clearly expensive, a single strand of pearls, hair pulled back in a way that highlighted her bone structure, minimal makeup that somehow made her look both devastated and beautiful. Every head turned when she entered. She moved to the front of the room slowly, her heels making soft clicks against the floor. She stopped in front of the casket, placed her hand on the polished wood, and bowed her head. From where I sat, I could see her shoulders shake slightly. She was crying, or performing crying so convincingly that it made no difference. After a long moment, she stepped back and took a seat in the third row. Not the family row, not the back, exactly where someone close, but not immediate, would sit. Callum turned slightly and met her eyes. The look lasted less than 2 seconds, but I saw it. Recognition, reassurance, connection. She nodded once and looked away. The women around her leaned in slightly. I could not hear what they were saying, but I could read their body language. Sympathy, approval. They thought she was a loyal friend, a colleague showing respect, someone who truly cared about the deceased. One woman touched Solène's arm gently. Another handed her a tissue. They had no idea they were comforting the woman who had spent 3 years helping dismantle my life. Solène accepted the tissue with a grateful smile and pressed it delicately to her eyes. The performance was so convincing, I almost believed it myself. Almost. The service began with soft music and a reading from someone I did not recognize. Then Callum stood. He walked to the podium slowly, his movements careful and measured. He adjusted the microphone, looked out at the assembled crowd, took a breath that suggested he was gathering strength to speak. "Marin was," he began, his voice breaking slightly on her name, "the most remarkable woman I have ever known." I dug my fingernails into my palms. "We met 15 years ago at a gallery in Brooklyn. She was explaining a piece of art to me, and I remember thinking, this woman sees the world in a way I never have. She found beauty in places I would have walked right past." Several people nodded. A few dabbed at their eyes. "Our marriage was not easy," he continued. "Marin struggled with things most people never saw. She had a fragile constitution, a sensitivity that made the world harder for her than it was for others." Delphine's hand found mine under the armrest. "She withdrew sometimes," Callum said, "pulled away from friends, from family, from activities she once loved. I tried to support her through those difficult periods. I tried to give her space when she needed it, and be present when she would allow me to be." My vision blurred with rage. In the end, her illness took her far too soon. But I want everyone here to know that Marin fought bravely. She never complained. She never asked for pity. She simply endured with as much grace as she could manage. He paused and looked directly at the casket. "Marin, wherever you are, I hope you have finally found peace. I hope the struggle is over. I hope you know that you were loved, even when you could not feel it." The room was silent, except for the sound of people crying. Callum stepped down from the podium. Eleanor reached out and squeezed his hand as he passed. He had just rewritten my entire existence, turned me into a tragic figure whose isolation was self-imposed, whose struggles were internal and unavoidable, whose death was a release from suffering. He had erased the affair, the manipulation, the conspiracy, the 3 years of deliberate destruction, and everyone in this room believed him. I could not breathe. Delphine's grip on my hand tightened so hard I thought my bones might break, but it was the only thing keeping me in my seat. He had done it. He had taken the fragments of our marriage and rearranged them into a story where he was the devoted husband and I was the broken wife, where my isolation was mental illness instead of his design, where my withdrawal was fragility instead of survival. And the worst part was how believable it sounded, because he had been building this narrative for years. Every time he told a colleague I was having a difficult day, every time he declined a social invitation on my behalf because I was not feeling well, every time he positioned himself as my caretaker instead of my captor, he had been writing this eulogy long before I was dead. The minister stood and invited people to come forward and pay their respects. A line formed along the side of the room. One by one, mourners approached the casket, placed their hands on the wood, bowed their heads, and moved on. I watched Callum accept condolences, watched Eleanor play the grieving mother-in-law, watched Celine sit quietly in her seat, a picture of respectful sorrow. And I made a choice. I could stand up right now and scream. I could tear apart his performance with volume and emotion and raw anger. I could tell everyone in this room exactly what kind of man Callum Thorne really was. But that would make me exactly what he had just described: unstable, emotional, fragile. So instead, I waited. I waited until the line of mourners had finished, until the room had settled into the heavy silence that follows collective grief, until the minister asked if anyone else wished to speak. That was when I stood. Delphine gasped. It was not part of the plan, but it was perfectly executed, loud enough to carry across the room, shocked enough to sound genuine. "Marin?" she said, her voice breaking on my name. Every head turned. I stepped into the aisle and removed my glasses, pushed my hair back from my face, stood in the light where everyone could see me clearly. The room went completely still. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. For a moment, the entire world seemed to suspend itself between heartbeats. Then, the whispers started. "Is that... It can't be... Is this some kind of joke? Does she have a twin?" I walked slowly down the aisle toward the front of the room. My footsteps echoed against the floor. People leaned away as I passed, like I was a ghost who might contaminate them if they got too close. Callum's face cycled through emotions faster than I could catalogue them. Disbelief, confusion, recognition, anger, and then, almost immediately, calculation. I saw the moment he started strategizing, started figuring out how to control this, how to turn this into another narrative he could manage. Solène had frozen completely. Her hand was halfway to Callum's arm, suspended in mid-air like a photograph. I stopped in front of the casket, placed my hand on the mahogany surface, looked at my own photograph smiling down at me. Then I turned to face the room. "I apologize for the confusion," I said. My voice was steady, calm, nothing like the fragile, broken woman Callum had just described. "I know this must be shocking, but I think we need to talk about who is actually in this casket." Silence. The answer is nobody. It's empty. Just like most of the things my husband has been saying for the past 3 years. The room erupted, not in screaming or chaos, but in a wave of shocked murmurs that built and crashed and built again. People turned to their neighbors, seeking confirmation that they were seeing what they thought they were seeing. Others pulled out phones, as if they needed to document this before it disappeared. Eleanor Thorne stood, her face white. "What is the meaning of this?" "The meaning," I said, turning to face her, "is that your son has been lying to you, to everyone, about a lot of things." Senator Thorne moved toward me, his politician's smile nowhere in evidence. "Mrs. Thorne, if you are experiencing some kind of crisis, we can get you help. But this is not the time or place." "For what? For the truth?" I looked at him directly. "Tell me, Senator, do you know about your brother's mistress? The one sitting 5 rows behind you?" Heads swiveled towards Solène. She stood slowly, her composure cracking. "Callum, what is she talking about?" But her performance was too late. I had already shifted the attention. "Her name is Solène Marchand," I continued, "and she has been having an affair with my husband for 3 years. But that is not the interesting part. The interesting part is why she was really there." Callum finally found his voice. "Maren, you are clearly unwell. This is exactly the kind of episode I was describing. You need help. Do the first." I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. "Because I have medical records here. A diagnosis of a terminal autoimmune condition, signed by a doctor. The same diagnosis that allowed you to have me declared dead, without anyone questioning it too closely." I held up the documents so everyone could see. But the real disease in this marriage was not in my body. It was in the way you systematically erased me while convincing everyone I was erasing myself. I turned to address the room, not just Callum. "My husband has been building a narrative about me for years. The fragile wife, the unstable woman, the person who withdrew from social events and struggled with mental health, and could not handle the pressures of being Mrs. Callum Thorne." Several people shifted uncomfortably, and some of that was true. I did withdraw. I did struggle. But not because I was mentally ill. Because I was being deliberately isolated. I opened the folder and pulled out printed emails. These are communications between my husband's law firm and Maurice Marchand, a corporate attorney who specializes in high-asset divorces. They discuss something called the Maren situation and long-term asset protection strategies. Callum's jaw tightened. "Maurice Marchand," I continued, "is Solène's father. Solène was not just my husband's mistress. She was inserted into his company 3 months after we moved to Westchester, 3 months after I stopped working, 3 months after I became financially dependent on him." I looked directly at Solène. "You were not just sleeping with my husband. You were his insurance policy, a witness who could testify to my instability if he ever needed to divorce me in a way that protected his assets." Solène's face had gone pale. "That's not—" "I didn't—" "You did not what? Fall in love with him? Maybe that part was real. But the framework was strategic. You were placed. You were told to monitor me, to document every time I seemed withdrawn or emotional or difficult." I turned back to the room. "I found out about the affair 6 months ago. I could have confronted him, filed for divorce, tried to fight this in court, but I knew what would happen. His firm has the best lawyers in the state. They would have used everything they had been collecting against me. They would have painted me as unstable, paranoid, unfit. My voice did not shake, so I made a different choice. I decided to let them think they had won. I faked my own death, using the very medical diagnosis his firm probably would have weaponized eventually. I let him plan this funeral. I let him stand at that podium and rewrite my entire existence. I gestured toward Callum, and then I walked in, so everyone could see exactly what kind of man eulogizes a wife he spent years destroying. The silence was absolute. If you are still watching this, I need you to think about something for a second. If you were in that room right now, watching a woman everyone thought was dead confront her husband and his mistress at her own funeral, whose side would you be on? Would you think she was justified in what she did? Would you think faking your own death to expose a conspiracy is taking things too far? Or would you understand that sometimes the only way to reveal the truth is to let people think they have gotten away with the lie? Hit like if you think she was right to walk in. Leave it if you think she should have stayed gone. Because I want to know where you stand on this. I looked at Solène one more time. She was still standing, frozen, her carefully constructed composure completely shattered. Mascara had started to run down her face. Her hands trembled. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. "You were not just my husband's mistress," I said quietly. "You were his alibi. The woman who could say I was unstable before things got bad. The woman who could testify that my isolation was self-imposed. The woman who made his version of the story believable." Solène opened her mouth, but no sound came out. "I do not know how much you knew," I continued. "I do not know if you understood you were part of a legal strategy, or if you thought this was just an affair, but either way, you helped erase me. And you were sitting in this room crying over a casket you knew was part of a lie." She looked at Callum, then back at me, then at the floor. She had nothing to say, because what defense could she possibly offer? Callum finally stepped forward. His face had settled into the expression I knew well, the one he used during arguments. Calm, reasonable, the voice of sanity in a room full of chaos. "Everyone," he said, addressing the crowd instead of me. "I know this is shocking. I know this seems impossible, but I want you to understand that my wife has been suffering from a very serious condition. This is exactly the kind of delusional episode her doctors warned me about." He looked at me with what might have passed for concern if I did not know him better. "Marin, please, let me get you help. Let me call Dr. Thatcher. We can work through this together." I smiled. It was not a kind smile. "You want to convince everyone I am crazy?" I asked. "Fine. Let's talk about who has really been writing fiction here." The funeral director appeared at the edge of the room, wringing his hands. "Perhaps we should move this discussion to a private space. This is highly irregular." "Irregular?" I laughed. "My husband staged a funeral for a woman who is not dead so he could rewrite the story of our marriage. But yes, my interruption is the irregular part." Several guests were already standing, gathering their belongings, clearly desperate to escape the situation. Others remained seated, frozen by the spectacle. Senator Thorne moved toward the funeral director. "I think we should call the authorities. There are legal implications here." "Absolutely," I said. "Let's call them. Let's have a conversation about fraud, about faking medical records, about conspiracy to commit financial abuse. I have documentation for all of it." I held up the folder again. "So yes, Senator, please, call the authorities. Because I have been waiting for someone to ask the right questions." Callum's calm mask finally cracked. "You have no idea what you have done," he said quietly. "I know exactly what I have done," I replied. "I stopped letting you decide whether I was alive or dead." The funeral home erupted into controlled chaos. The funeral director was making frantic phone calls. Half the guests were filing out, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal. The other half remained, phone cameras raised, documenting everything. Eleanor Thorne grabbed her son's arm, hissing something I could not hear. Senator Thorne was already on his phone, likely calling lawyers or damage control specialists or both. Delphine appeared at my elbow. "We need to leave. Now." But before we could move, 2 police officers entered through the main doors. Someone had called them. Probably the funeral director, trying to restore order to a situation that had gone completely off script. "Ma'am," one of the officers said, approaching me carefully, "we are going to need you to come with us." "Am I under arrest?" "We just need to ask you some questions about the situation." Callum stepped forward. "Officers, my wife has been missing for 2 weeks. She was declared legally dead. Her appearance here is as shocking to me as it is to everyone else. I think she needs medical evaluation, not interrogation." The officer looked between us, clearly trying to piece together what was happening. "I am not having a medical crisis," I said calmly. "I am happy to answer questions, but I would like my lawyer present." "Your lawyer?" "Vera Sinclair. She handled my will and she is aware of my situation." Within an hour, we were sitting in a private conference room at Vera's office. Callum and his lawyer sat on one side of the table. Delphine, Vera, and I sat on the other. The police had agreed to delay formal questioning until both parties had legal representation present. Callum's lawyer spoke first. A man named Harrison with silver hair and a suit that cost more than most cars. "Mrs. Thorne, you have committed several serious crimes: falsifying medical records, faking your own death, fraud related to your will and estate. My client is prepared to press charges unless you can provide a very compelling explanation." Vera did not flinch. "Your client has committed fraud as well: conspiracy to commit financial abuse, intentional infliction of emotional distress, using his firm's resources to surveil and gaslight his spouse. Shall we compare documentation?" She slid a folder across the table. Harrison opened it. His expression did not change, but I saw his jaw tighten. "These are emails between Mr. Thorne's firm and Maurice Marchand," Vera continued. "They discuss asset protection strategies that involve documenting Mrs. Thorne's supposed mental instability. They also detail the deliberate placement of Mr. Marchand's daughter into Mr. Thorne's company for monitoring purposes." Callum leaned forward. "Those emails are privileged attorney-client communications." "They are evidence of conspiracy," Vera interrupted. "And they would be very interesting to the State Bar Association, not to mention the press." Silence. "My client," Vera said, "is willing to negotiate a settlement that protects both parties from public scandal and legal consequences. But it will not be on your terms." The negotiation took 3 days. We met in Vera's conference room each morning and argued until evening. Harrison brought documentation proving that I had committed fraud. Vera countered with evidence that the fraud was provoked by a larger pattern of abuse and manipulation. They threatened criminal charges. We threatened civil suits that would expose everything to the public. Back and forth. Point and counterpoint. Legal threats and tactical retreats. Senator Thorne attended the second day of negotiations. Not officially, but his presence changed the temperature of the room. He sat beside his brother, silent, his face a mask of controlled fury. "This cannot become public," he said finally. "I have a re-election campaign in 18 months. If this story breaks, it destroys my family's reputation." "Then tell your brother to be reasonable," Delphine said. "Reasonable?" Callum's voice was sharp. "She faked her own death. She committed fraud. She humiliated me in front of everyone I know." "You were already planning to humiliate her," I said quietly. "You were building a legal case to take everything from her while making her look unstable. I just beat you to it." Harrison cleared his throat. "Perhaps we can find middle ground, a settlement that allows both parties to walk away without criminal charges or public litigation." Vera leaned back. "I am listening." The terms were hammered out over the next 6 hours. I would receive a divorce settlement that included half of the marital assets, calculated before any of the transfers to Celine or hidden accounts. Callum would agree to a non-disparagement clause that prevented him from publicly discussing my mental health or the circumstances of our divorce. In exchange, I would not press civil charges related to the conspiracy, the surveillance, or the emotional abuse. I would not provide the documentation to the press or the State Bar Association. The faked death would be explained as a mental health crisis brought on by my terminal diagnosis. I would undergo a psychiatric evaluation that would find me competent and not a danger to myself or others. The death certificate would be voided. The will would be withdrawn from probate. Both sides would sign statements agreeing that all criminal and civil matters were resolved. It was not justice, but it was freedom. "There is one more condition," I said. Harrison raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Thorne, I think we have been more than generous." "Solène Marchand," I interrupted. "She leaves the firm immediately, and her father's retainer is terminated. No severance package that looks like hush money. A clean, quiet exit with a standard non-disclosure agreement." Callum stared at me. "Why do you care what happens to her? Because she is the only other person in this room who knows what it feels like to be used by you." He looked away. Harrison made a note. "We can agree to those terms." Vera nodded. "Then we have a deal." I signed the papers 2 days later. Marin Ashford Thorne officially stopped being dead, and she officially stopped being married to Callum Thorne. I did not plan to speak to Solène again. The settlement had been finalized. The papers were signed. I was prepared to walk away and never think about her or Callum or any of it again. But 3 days after the documents were processed, she called Delphine. She wanted to meet. Just the two of us. One conversation. Delphine thought it was a terrible idea. "She could be recording you. This could be another setup." "Maybe," I said, "but I want to hear what she has to say." We met at a coffee shop in neutral territory. Solène arrived exactly on time, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of the designer clothes I'd always seen her in. Without the polish, she looked younger, tired. We sat across from each other without ordering anything. "I do not expect you to forgive me," she said finally. "I just wanted you to know that I did not understand what I was part of. Not at first." "When did you figure it out?" "About a year in. I found emails on my father's computer, plans for your divorce, strategies for documenting your isolation. I realized I had not been hired because I was good at my job. I had been hired because of who my father was and what he could help them accomplish." She looked down at her hands. "By then, I had already fallen in love with Callum. Or I thought I had. It is hard to know now what was real and what I convinced myself was real, because the alternative was admitting I had been used." "So you stayed." "I stayed. My father promised me a career. Callum promised me a future. And I told myself that maybe you actually were the problem. That maybe the things they said about you were true. It was easier than admitting I was complicit in destroying someone." I said nothing. "I watched you at the funeral," Solène continued, "when you walked in. And I realized something. You had the courage to burn down your entire life to escape him. And I had spent 3 years helping him build the cage." Her eyes were wet. "I am leaving the city," she said, "going back to France. My mother's family is there. I need to be somewhere that is not connected to any of this." "Good." She looked up, surprised. "You helped erase me," I said, "and I will never forgive that. But I also understand that the Thorne family machine shapes everyone it touches. My husband used you the same way he used me, just differently." Solène wiped at her eyes. "Do not let them do it again," I said. "Do not let anyone make you small enough to fit inside their plans. Figure out who you are when nobody is telling you who to be." She nodded slowly. We did not hug. We did not exchange phone numbers or promises to stay in touch. She simply stood, whispered thank you, and walked out. I never saw her again. I could have destroyed him. The evidence Delphine and I had collected was enough to ruin Callum's reputation, damage his firm, and create a scandal that would have followed his family for years. I could have gone to the press, written a book, given interviews, turned my story into a weapon that guaranteed he would never forget what he had done. Part of me wanted to. Late at night, alone in the apartment I had rented under my own name for the first time in 11 years, I would think about how satisfying it would be to watch him lose clients, to see his firm investigated, to know that every time someone searched his name online, my story would appear. But revenge like that required me to stay connected to him, to build my new life around his downfall, to define myself by what he had done to me instead of who I was becoming. And I refused to give him that power. So I made a different choice. I kept copies of everything, the emails, the testimonies, the timeline. I put it all in a safety deposit box with instructions that if anything happened to me or if Callum ever violated the terms of our settlement, Delphine would release everything. It was not vengeance. It was insurance. Then I started building something new. I reconnected with the Brooklyn Gallery where I had worked 15 years ago. The owners were older now, ready to retire, looking for someone to take over. They remembered me. Remembered my eye for art and my passion for the work. They offered me a partnership. I accepted. I moved into a small apartment in Brooklyn, the kind of place with exposed brick and old hardwood floors and windows that looked out over the street. It was 1/10 the size of the Westchester house, and I loved every inch of it. I started using my maiden name again, Marin Ashford, not Thorne, not Mrs. Anything, just Marin. I hung the leaving on my living room wall, the woman in the doorway, half in shadow, half in light. And every time I looked at it, I thought about what Callum had said the day we met, that she was deciding whether to stay. He had been wrong. She had already decided. She was walking through that door into whatever came next, and so was I. 6 months after the funeral that was not a funeral, I woke up in my Brooklyn apartment to morning light streaming through old windows. The apartment was small. A studio with exposed brick and creaking floors and a radiator that clanged every morning like it was angry about having to work. The building was over 100 years old, and everything in it felt lived in, real, imperfect. I loved it more than I had ever loved the Westchester house. I made coffee in a chipped mug I had bought at a street market. Not French press, not carefully measured. Just coffee. I sat on the floor because my furniture was still minimal, leaning against the wall where the leaving hung above me. The woman in the doorway looked different now than she had when Callum first bought the painting for me. Or maybe I was the one who looked different, and that changed everything else. My phone buzzed. A text from Delphine. Still good for today? I smiled and typed back. Absolutely. We were driving upstate. Not to the cabin exactly, just to the lake. To see the place where Marin Thorne was supposed to have died, and where Marin Ashford had decided to live instead. I got dressed slowly. Jeans and a sweater. Boots that were practical instead of fashionable. No makeup beyond what made me feel like myself. I looked in the mirror and saw someone I recognized. Not the gallery girl from 15 years ago. Not the wife from the Westchester house. Someone new. Someone built from the pieces of both and the strength it took to walk away from what was killing me. I grabbed my keys and headed out. The Brooklyn Gallery had changed since I worked there in my 20s. New ownership, different artists, a focus on emerging voices instead of established names. But the bones of the place were the same. The tall windows, the wooden floors, the smell of paint and possibility. I co-owned it now with 2 other women. Elena, who had taken over from the original owners, and G1, who specialized in digital and mixed media art. We split the work evenly. Curating, event planning, the administrative tasks that kept the doors open. It was not glamorous. We barely broke even most months. We spent weekends installing shows ourselves, hauling frames and adjusting lighting and arguing about wall placement. We drank cheap wine at openings and talked to artists who were terrified their work would not sell. But it was mine. Not in the sense of ownership, though my name was on the paperwork. Mine in the sense that every decision I made there came from what I believed, not what someone else expected. I chose artists whose work moved me. I said no to pieces that felt empty, no matter how commercially viable. I had conversations with visitors about art and beauty and pain, without worrying whether I sounded intelligent enough or polished enough, or like the right kind of woman. Last week, a young artist had cried in my office after we agreed to show her work. She said she had been rejected by 17 galleries, that she had almost given up. I told her I understood what it felt like to almost give up. I did not tell her the whole story, but I think she knew I was not just talking about art. This work did not pay well. It did not come with prestige or social status or invitations to the kind of events I used to attend, but I woke up every morning wanting to do it, and that was worth more than anything Callum's money had ever bought. Delphine picked me up at 10. We drove north in her car with the windows down, despite the cold, music playing low, talking about nothing important. She told me about a date she had gone on that ended badly. I told her about the new installation we were planning at the gallery. We sounded like sisters again. Not the distant, careful versions of ourselves from the years of my marriage. The real versions. The ones who used to stay up late talking about everything and nothing. The ones who knew each other's fears without having to explain them. We reached the lake just after noon. The cabin was still standing. I had decided not to burn it after all, and Delphine had hired someone to do basic maintenance, winterizing, repairs, keeping it from falling apart. We did not go inside. Instead, we walked down to the water and stood at the edge, looking out at the still surface. "Do you regret it?" Delphine asked. "Any of it?" I thought about the question seriously. I regret staying as long as I did. I regret not seeing what was happening sooner. I regret letting him convince me that leaving would make me the villain. But the rest? The plan? No. I needed to do something that woke me up. Something that proved I still had the power to make choices, even if they were terrifying ones. Delphine nodded slowly. "Mom would have lost her mind if she knew what we did," she said. I laughed. Mom would have helped us plan it better, and then lectured us for being reckless. Accurate. We stood in silence for a while, the cold wind coming off the water, the smell of pine and earth and early winter. "Thank you," I said, "for not giving up on me, for finding me when I was disappearing." Delphine took my hand. "You're my sister. I was always going to find you." The external changes in my life were obvious. Different apartment, different work, different last name on my bank accounts and my driver's license. I had legally dropped Thorn and gone back to Ashford. Some days I introduced myself as Maren Evelyn Ashford, keeping the name I had used when I was invisible as a reminder that I never wanted to be that person again. But the internal changes were harder to describe. I made decisions differently now. When someone invited me somewhere, I asked myself whether I actually wanted to go instead of whether I should. When I felt uncomfortable, I said so instead of swallowing it and calling it politeness. When I needed space, I took it without apologizing. I had started therapy 3 months ago, not because I thought I was broken, but because I wanted to understand how I had become someone who would rather fake her own death than ask for help. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Okafor, had asked me during our first session what I wanted to achieve. "I want to stop being afraid," I had said. "Of what?" "Of taking up space, of making people angry, of being too much or not enough, or the wrong version of myself." She had nodded like that made perfect sense. We talked about boundaries, about how isolation felt safe when trust had been weaponized, about the difference between being alone and being lonely. I learned that I was not fragile. I was someone who had survived something designed to break her. That was not the same as being weak. That was proof of strength I had not known I had. The woman I was now did not need permission to exist. She did not need to be smaller or quieter or more convenient. She just needed to keep showing up as herself, even when that felt impossible. Especially when that felt impossible. I looked at the leaving every day. It hung above my bed in the small studio apartment, the first thing I saw when I woke up and the last thing I saw before I turned off the lights at night. The woman in the doorway, half in shadow, half in light. Callum had said she was deciding whether to stay, that the painting was about the moment of choice, the weight of leaving, the difficulty of walking away. He had been wrong. Or maybe he had been right about what the artist intended, but wrong about what the painting meant to me. I did not see a woman debating anymore. I saw someone who had already made her decision, who was standing in that doorway not because she was uncertain, but because she was gathering her courage for the next step. The shadow behind her was not safety. It was everything that would kill her if she stayed. The light ahead was not guaranteed happiness. It was just the unknown, which was terrifying but necessary. She was not leaving. She was saving herself. That was what I had done. Not perfectly, not without consequences, not in a way that anyone would recommend or that made logical sense when you listed the steps out loud. But I had stepped through the doorway. I had walked out of the shadow and into the light. And even though I did not know what came next, I knew I could not go back. The painting was not about leaving a place. It was about leaving a version of yourself that was dying and becoming someone new on the other side. If you are watching this story and you feel something tightening in your chest, pay attention to that feeling, because I ignored it for years. I told myself that discomfort was normal, that marriage required sacrifice, that good women stayed and worked on things and did not give up when life got hard. But there is a difference between working on a relationship and disappearing inside one. There is a difference between compromise and erasure. I learned that you do not have to fake your own death to be reborn. You do not have to stage a dramatic exit or expose everyone who hurt you or burn down your entire life to prove you survived it. You just have to stop letting other people write your story. You have to stop abandoning yourself in the name of commitment. Silence can protect you when you need time to plan. But silence can also destroy you if you use it to excuse staying in a situation that is killing you slowly. I chose silence as a strategy. I watched and gathered evidence and built a case before I acted, but I should have chosen noise years earlier. I should have asked for help when I first felt invisible. I should have called Delphine when Callum started isolating me. I should have trusted my instincts instead of letting him convince me they were paranoia. If you are disappearing inside your own life right now, let this be a sign. You are allowed to leave the room. You are allowed to say no, to ask questions, to demand better, to walk away from people who make you feel small, even if those people are supposed to love you. Especially if those people are supposed to love you. You do not owe anyone your silence. You do not owe anyone your suffering. You are allowed to choose yourself. So let me ask you this. Would you have done what I did? If you discovered your partner's affair was part of a legal strategy to destroy you, would you have faked your death and walked into your own funeral? Or would you have found a different way out? I want to know. Not because I need validation, but because I think we all have different breaking points. Different moments when we decide enough is enough. Different ways we reclaim our lives when someone tries to take them from us. Tell me in the comments. No judgment, just honesty. What would you have done? And if this story made you feel something, if it reminded you of someone you know or someone you used to be, hit that like button. Let it reach the people who need to hear it. Because the truth is, there are so many of us walking around half erased, disappearing inside marriages, jobs, families, friendships, letting other people define who we are until we forget we ever had a choice. You have a choice. You have always had a choice. If you want more stories like this, stories that go beneath the surface and into the lives we do not talk about at dinner parties, subscribe. Turn on notifications. This channel is called Beneath Our Last Name because the most important stories are the ones we hide behind polite smiles and perfect photographs. I have more stories for you. Stories about women who left, who stayed, who fought back in ways nobody expected, who rebuilt themselves from nothing. Stories about survival that does not look the way people think it should. Stay with me. And remember, you do not have to die to be reborn. You just have to be brave enough to walk through the doorway.